Prime Day, even if it's a softer year-over-year comparison, it is still such an important shopping event for so many brands.
Yeah.
It's, introducing yourself, acquiring new to brand has such value over the months and even year to come. I think the biggest takeaway for me is that 10-day lead up period was so important this year. And so it continues to emphasize the strategy that you need to have in place ahead of Black Friday and Cyber Monday, which will be here before we know it. Think about that before we head into Prime next year.
What started as a sort of like shopping experiment turned into almost a nationwide, worldwide holiday. And there's a lot going on here. And of course, if we had 2 hours, we'd talk about it all. But this is a good snapshot, I think, a good blitz, if you will, into the data. All right, everyone, we are talking Prime Day 2024. There has been enough time that's passed for data to solidify, for it to be accurate, and we're talking through a lot of metrics today. So, Laura, I'm happy to have you. This is a true blitz, a true benchmark blitz. We're going to do our best to really speed through some of the highlights from all the data of Prime Day 2024. So, Laura, why don't we just jump right in? Let's just get right into it. What is our first data point to cover talking about Prime Day 2024?
Sounds good. But right before we jump into the data points, I do want to mention that the data we'll be looking at today is US-based data specifically. We'll talk internationally a bit later, but this is Prime Day period performance. So you'll see some of the lead up and then Prime Days themselves. And this is a true year-over-year comparison of same store data. So same store means we're not incorporating any data from brands that were not in the before view or they were in the before view and not the after view. So this should be quality period over period comparison.
Real quick, what difference does that make? International, US, that just slightly changes how we're pulling the numbers, where we're pulling the numbers from, correct?
And just if you're comparing to other sources in the space that may be messaging, just make sure you understand what that performance looks like. We know the US is an incredibly important market in terms of percentage of sales. And we know that there are factors and influences that may occur in the US. The 4th of July was just, a week or so before that doesn't necessarily impact international markets. So we did want to just zoom in on the US today. Again, internationally will be coming, but it's just always important to know the source of the data that you're looking at.
Yep, good to know.
So diving right into that first metric, let's talk about traffic just in general. This influences so much. In 2024, ad traffic increased for each time period leading up to and during Prime Days. So the greatest increase year over year was actually in the 10 days leading up to Prime Days. With one small caveat, I want to mention that last year, the lead up period did include the 4th of July. So we know people may have been out, enjoying some outdoor time or just generally time offline. But still that 22% increase, even considering that caveat, is a pretty significant year over year increase. So that lead up period, it indicates that lead up period was incredibly important in 2024 and finding success during this Prime Day event.
Do we really know why, or just probably maybe the July 4th having to do with that, but outside of that?
Yeah, I think I also saw that Amazon, I don't know if the experience for you is the same. Amazon was really messaging Prime Days earlier. Sometimes it's only a few days before the event that they'll begin to announce or even advertise it. And I saw it on linear TV. I saw it on websites. I just saw that Amazon increased their advertising about Prime Day earlier this year than I recall last year. Again, that is a data point of one, but my experience and others have collaborated on that as well.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Okay, what about cost?
Yeah, as expected in a PPC space, as traffic increased, so did cost. And spend increased, pretty notably in those 10 days prior, up 29% year over year. So eclipsing that 22% increase in clicks. Prime Day spend increased 13% year over year with pretty even increases across day one and day two. Day one has historically been a more valuable day in terms of both traffic and sales volume, but cost increased pretty evenly across both days.
Yep.
While spend increased 13% year over year, it increased 175% to the average daily baseline before Prime Days.
Okay,
So that's how much of a jump it is.
can you break that 175 down for me? What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so when we look at like the lead-in period or the baseline before Prime Days, the jump in daily ad spend, we're saying, oh, it's a 13% increase year over year, but that's compared to a Prime Day that has additional spend, has additional traffic. And so when we look from a normal day before Prime Days, there was a 175% increase in cost from the daily pre-Prime Day period to Prime Days themselves.
Got it.
And that is compared to, I believe it was 125% increase in traffic from baseline to Prime Days themselves.
Okay. Okay. Wow. That's significant. So
Yeah.
primary takeaway here, there's a whole lot more ad spend going on across the board here, especially 10 days prior to Prime Day.
Yeah, 10 days prior was important, and that's part of the baseline. That was certainly much
Yes.
lower than the jump that we saw into Prime Days, but year over year, the 10 days prior appears to have been a more important period than it has been in years past.
Year over year, the percentage change was the greatest at the very least 10 days prior. Got it. Okay.
Yeah,
that
right.
makes sense. I'm tracking. There's a lot of
All
data
right.
to blitz through here. Okay, let's talk CPC.
A lot of data to blitz through. Yeah. Luckily, recordings, you can pause and digest the graphs, but we'll keep moving a bit. As I mentioned, the cost increases were a little bit higher than the traffic increases, which of course tells us that CPCs then increased year over year as well. Just as a general baseline, in the H1 2024 recap Benchmark Blitz episode that you and I held, there was about a 15% year over year increase in CPCs for H1. And so when we look at the increases that we saw in the days prior and Prime Days themselves fall below that 15%, that's actually promising that, in fact, Q3 year over year increases are stabilizing a little bit, which we did predict. That was the same trend we saw 2022 to 2023. But in general, I do just want to highlight that the greatest increase was on Prime Day 1, right? That's where historically we've seen the most traffic, the most sales. So it makes sense that competition really came in hard on day 1 of Prime Day.
Yep.
And that was about 12% increase. And then it is important to highlight that, again, this is a year over year comparison. If we're comparing CPCs on Prime Day 1 or Prime Days across the board compared to the baseline, that was a 22% increase.
Yep.
So still pretty moderate in comparison to that 15% that we saw in H1, but definitely a competitive time period and one that you were hopefully prepared for in terms of those bid and budget adjustments.
Yep. Good. So kind of summarizing this again, important takeaways, percentage change year over year, increased kind of across the board here, especially Prime Day 1. However, was more moderate compared to H1 that we saw and that we walked through, H1 CPCs across the board, which again is in line with what you predicted, and is kind of a good sign.
Yeah, and it's a pretty common trend that Q3 CPCs stabilized a little bit before Q4. But even during Prime Days, it's great to see that year over year percent increase stabilization holding true, even recognizing increases.
It's good to see that hasn't broken outside of the norm when it comes to CPCs.
Yes, I'm sure a lot of sellers are relieved to
hear
that as well.
And within reason, relieved. Yes, that makes sense. Okay, what about ad sales?
Yeah, ad sales. This is what everybody wants to know, right? How did we really measure up? So we actually saw for our cohort of customers, there was a decline year over year in terms of ad sales on Prime Days themselves, just shy of 10%, 9% in aggregate, and actually the most from day 1, which is such a historically important day. There's so many factors that could go into this. Certain brands were not willing to discount or discount quite as deeply because margins were already hit. Maybe they have worked all year to focus on organic and reduce advertising. Perhaps they were at their break even with margins and they just couldn't justify, running a discount and running advertising quite as deeply. But
Yep.
we did see that decrease. However, take a look at that 10 days prior
Yep.
again. That was, such an interesting but significant part of the entire Prime Day event, where we saw, over a 20%, 22% increase in ad sales leading up to Prime Days. So people were shopping earlier and they were
Fascinating.
actually converting as they were shopping earlier.
That's fascinating to see the trends and the comparisons here 10 days prior. Like if you go back to clicks, if you go to cost, if you go to CPCs, pairing it with this ad sales, that is very fascinating. I mean, we do kind of we've mentioned in years past, people shopping early or at least adding to cart early. Interesting to see this interaction with ads as a part of that
Yeah.
as well, especially so significant.
Yeah, and it is attributed to day of click, right?
Mhm.
So they could have purchased on Prime Days. We would have expected them to maybe encounter another ad during that time period. But it could have been, that they shopped in that 10 days prior and then they converted on Prime Days, and that's
Yep.
being attributed back to that time period. So we tell you it's a significant time period. It's a cheaper time period, right? CPCs are 22% cheaper than they were during Prime Days. So it is a good time to
Mm.
make sure that you're top of mind in the consumer cart wish list or what have you.
Yep. That's good proof. What about conversion rate?
Conversion rate. Yeah, so despite, we saw that increase in traffic, we saw, varied impact in ad sales, but we actually saw conversion rate increase across the board, between 3 and 5%. So nothing significant, but really kind of maintaining and holding true year over year in terms of that conversion rate. So the big story really comes down to AOV.
Mm.
We saw AOV
Wow.
decrease. And so this could have been prioritization of less expensive products. I don't know that we've seen in all of the data released that there were deeper discounts. And so it also could be buyer selection of maybe I'm not willing to buy the, Roomba this year, maybe I want to buy a smaller appliance or more beauty. It seems that in general, lower ticket items were more popular this year.
Wow. That's very fascinating to see that
Yeah.
jump.
Pretty
Wow.
significant too, right? Prime Day
It
is
is.
almost an 18% decrease
Wow.
year over year. So
That's incredible.
that's a pretty notable AOV decrease that indicates fewer products in the basket or cheaper products in the basket.
Cheaper products or fewer products in the basket. Very fascinating.
Yeah.
Um, okay, what do you have for me next? Or is next kind of the overall comparison?
Yeah, so we
Wow.
just wanted to
Good.
give you an overall look of, where was everything in aggregate. This is for the 2 Prime Days themselves. So again, we saw
Mhm.
clicks and CPCs increase, which led to that increase in cost. Despite the increase in clicks and, almost an 8% increase in ad orders, that AOV really had an impact on ad sales. And then total sales followed. It really is important. It's such
Yep.
a competitive day, that advertising is almost even more important to continue to drive and boost up those sales. I do want to mention, as of the recording, we are still in the attribution window for ad sales, but we know by this point, we've settled about 95% of sales.
Yep. That's an important note for people to take into consideration. Laura, is there anything on this screen that surprised you, or what surprised you the most looking at this data?
Still that AOV.
Yeah.
We know that it's the year over year AOV, right? I wouldn't necessarily be as surprised if it was a decrease from the baseline or the pre-Prime Day period because of the discounts. And we know that, people coming to Prime or Prime Days are shopping for a bargain, right?
Right.
They're
Of
shopping
course.
for a sale. But that AOV year over year is a pretty significant decrease. And really having an impact that despite additional traffic, despite additional orders and a conversion rate holding true, that AOV had such a significant impact.
Got it. Okay. Now, what about the 10-day lead up?
Yeah, so the 10-day lead up plus Prime Days. So this is the 12 days, kind of 12 days of Prime. Maybe a new song to come for that. But I just wanted to take a look at it as a more holistic shopping event. And this doesn't include the lead out, which we know is a very critical time period as well, that we're still in the midst of. But looking at the 10-day lead up plus Prime Days, we see a very different story. That if you were there, if you were visible and advertising, you know, weren't too shy knowing that ROAS may not come immediately in that 10-day period, but we saw traffic increase, of course, spend increased, but that ad sales actually increased 8% year over year, due to additional ad orders. The only thing we're still seeing as a decrease year over year is that AOV, if you look at that time period.
Which makes sense. I mean, this still again solidifies the lead up, build up period into Prime Day, into the Prime Days. Maybe that this period will get longer. Maybe it'll keep on getting pushed back further and further. Who knows? But this solidifies that, like the strategy, the need to kind of strategize early,
Yeah.
leading into the Prime Days.
Absolutely. And I hope Amazon sees as well, you know, the benefits that came from what, you know, what I think is highly attributed to the earlier advertising that they did, you know, outside of just the app, right? Every time you logged
Right.
into the app, you saw it for weeks in advance, but, you know, really getting into linear TV and other places online, seeing that Prime Days were coming, and getting people in and shopping ahead of time.
Absolutely. Now, one other area that interests people a lot is category, right? So which category performed best, worst, what their category did. So what data do you have
Yeah.
concerning category?
Taking a look at that, we always like to look at click and cost. This is for Prime Days specifically, so we did exclude the 10-day lead up, for this period in general. A few notes here is we saw the most significant increase in traffic and therefore, of course, cost for appliances, beauty and personal care, clothing, shoes and jewelry, and electronics. Electronics, small appliances, and beauty and personal care are usually popular categories on Prime Days. Um, Clothing and jewelry, shoes and jewelry actually seems to be growing as a category on Amazon. So none of these were particularly surprising to me in terms of seeing a year over year increase. What surprised me the most from this data was the decrease in health and household
Mm.
and that really minimal increase in home and kitchen. You know, there's some smaller ticket items that, you know, knives aren't always cheaper, but you know, certain things that people are buying for their household that I was surprised to see either minimal increases or decreases.
So this decrease for health and household, as an example, just means that overall there was just less traffic, less people buying in the health and health and household category. Geez, there it is.
Yeah.
There was
Yeah,
less
I
people overall.
it's I know we can't use the chicken and the egg anymore. We've solved that. But you know, looking at this, it could be maybe they've hit the majority of these brands and these categories are hitting their break even and they can't invest as much in advertising. And
Yeah.
so they're getting less aggressive and so they're pulling in less traffic. So it could be there were fewer shoppers. It could be they were pulling in less through advertising because they could be less aggressive. They were already running a deal and they didn't want to do advertising on top of it. So when you look at ad traffic, it is there are multiple inputs influencing it.
Yeah.
It could be shopper volume, or it could be, you know, how aggressive these brands were being.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's complicated. I mean, that kind of makes sense in the health and household category as well. Margins, maybe deals being run. Like there's a lot that goes into that, but this is fascinating. Okay, so what about ad sales
Yeah,
percentage?
ad sales, we saw very similar, of course, to traffic. You know, traffic is gonna lead to those conversions and, you know, AOV is obviously gonna play a pretty big role here.
Right.
Appliances saw over 100% year over year increase, which is incredible.
Yeah.
Beauty
Wow.
and personal care, which has always been a bigger brand or a bigger category during Prime Days, one of my personal favorites to shop on Prime Days, really stock up, still saw a 60% increase year over year. So two incredible categories, two category wins this year over last. That clothing, shoes, and jewelry, I think we are continuing to see more recognizable brands join Amazon, and we're continuing to see increased interest in this category. So this one didn't surprise me, but definitely seeing that increase year over year. Toys and games, home and kitchen, I did not leave off this graph. They were flat year over year.
Wow.
So, you know, interesting
That
to
is
see
interesting. For
health and
toys and
house.
games, it's interesting. It's also interesting to see electronics not increasing by that much. I don't know if that's typical or not. Um, maybe it
Yeah,
is, maybe it isn't.
that is actually, thank you for that lead
Oh,
up, because of its AOV.
wow.
While conversion rate, it saw some additional traffic and conversion rate increased almost 20%. AOV decreased more than 30.
Wow.
Um, and so this is probably a fundamental shift in the products being purchased under that category. That's not a discount alone. And as you see AOV decrease, you expect conversion rate to increase and vice versa. People are more willing to part ways with $5 versus $500.
Yep.
Um, and so, AOV again was one of the biggest stories for those that did not see the more significant year-over-year increases. And then we actually saw that a lot in appliances
Wow.
where AOV increased 50%, nearly 50% year over year.
And conversion dropped. I
And
mean,
conversion rate dropped. But again, that's
yeah,
expected. As
it
you're
is
you're
expected.
purchasing more expensive products, that conversion rate does decrease. That's totally an expected um, balancing. Beauty and personal care actually broke that mold with
Mhm.
both an AOV and a conversion rate increase, though.
Wow, fascinating. Interesting trends going on. Um, I want to leave the door open for anything else on this slide, but I also am just curious. Like we went through a lot of data. There's a lot of info here for people to comb through. But your general takeaways, kind of summarizing after combing through all this data yourself, generally, what do you think? How do you think Prime Day went?
Yeah, Prime Day, always an important event. We are looking at year-over-year increases, but again, it's really off that baseline. These are still significant boosts in sales from the 10-day lead up or the average day in June or July. So Prime Day, even if it's a softer year-over-year comparison, it is still such an important shopping event for so many brands.
Yeah.
It's, introducing yourself, acquiring new to brand has such value over the months and even year to come. The I think the biggest takeaway for me is that 10-day lead up period was so important this year. And so it continues to emphasize the strategy that you need to have in place ahead of Black Friday and Cyber
Yep.
Monday, which will be here before we know it. Think about that before we head into Prime next year. And then we're talking about the before and during period. We are in the midst of the after time frame, and that is a equally important time period if you play it right. If you ran a deal, I hope you're continuing to focus on maintaining visibility and to use that customer data that you now have, whether they were new to brand or a repeat purchaser, to continue to target additional products within, under your brand to those members, to those shoppers. And if you didn't run deals or didn't run a deal on a top product, monitor your bestseller rank and make sure you're investing now when CPCs are cheaper to
Mhm.
make sure that you are maintaining or boosting that bestseller rank back up. So the event is not done. We are, as advertisers, still making sure that we're maintaining health, we're maintaining efficiency and visibility, and then maintaining or taking riding that halo effect
Mhm.
if you were a discount
It
had a discounted product during that time.
it is overall fascinating to see what started as a sort of like shopping experiment turn into almost a nationwide, worldwide holiday, and just how that changes, and maybe it not being like the a read on the entire market over the entire year, but a pretty good viewpoint into how the market is responding, how shoppers and buyers are responding at a moment in time. Perhaps a good indicator for how things will go, like for the rest of the year in Q4. So all really interesting data. If you haven't yet, well, obviously go back and check through all this data again, but also go check out the H1 benchmark blitz that we did because this is interesting data to mix with that as well. There's a lot going on here. And of course, if we had 2 hours, we'd talk about it all. But this is a good snapshot, I think, a good blitz, if you will, into the data. So, Laura, thank you again for walking us through this. There's definitely more to come. But for now, this gives a really good snapshot into everything that's going on. So, thank you again, and we'll chat soon.
Thanks, Cam.